The challenge had seemed reasonable at the time. That was what Cadet Vorith kept telling himself as he lay flat on the training mat, staring up at the vaulted ceiling of the Galactic Academy's combat hall, wondering if his thorax had actually collapsed or merely felt that way. It had started, as most disasters do, with overconfidence. Vorith was a Kelthari, a species whose warriors had held galactic military rankings for 3 consecutive centuries. Their exoskeletons were rated at 4 times the impact resistance of standard organic plating. Their reflexes operated at speeds that made most species look like they were moving through cooling gel. He was, by every metric the Academy tracked, the top-ranked cadet in his year. And then Griffin Hayes had shown up. The human had arrived 6 standard weeks ago, transferred from some remote program on Earth, a planet that the Academy's briefing documents described with clinical detachment as a Class 7 environmental hazard zone. Griffin was tall for his species, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of quiet stillness that Vorith had initially mistaken for submission. The other cadets had made the same mistake. Griffin's first week had been unremarkable. He attended classes, passed assessments without drama, and spoke rarely. He ate food that made the Thalvari cadets physically back away from the cafeteria table. Aurora Blake, his fellow human and the only other Terran in the cohort, had explained to anyone who asked that the dish was something called ghost pepper noodles, and that yes, it was supposed to look like that, and no, he was not in distress. Aurora was different from Griffin in every surface way. Where he was quiet, she was sharp-tongued and social. Where he kept his head down, she had already built a network of alliances across 6 species by the end of day 3. She had the kind of diplomatic instinct that made instructors take notes when she spoke. But she watched Griffin with the same careful attention that a navigator gives a horizon, and that told Vorith more than anything else. The incident that changed everything happened during open sparring. Vorith had requested the match himself. He had framed it generously, a cultural exchange, a chance for the human to learn from a superior tradition. Several cadets gathered to observe. Instructor Mayrath stood at the edge of the mat, arms folded, expression unreadable behind her feathered crest. Griffin had looked at the mat, then at Vorith, then said simply, "Okay." That single syllable should have been the warning. The match lasted 11 seconds. Vorith had opened with a Kelthari pressure combination, 3 rapid strikes designed to overwhelm an opponent's reaction window, followed by a grapple that exploited the natural joint vulnerabilities of most bipedal species. It had worked on every opponent he had faced in 4 years of training. Griffin moved. Vorith had studied the footage afterward, slowing it down to individual frames. Even then, it was difficult to fully parse. The human had not blocked. He had redirected, absorbing the momentum of the first strike and rotating in a way that brought him inside Vorith's guard before the second strike could land. Then Griffin had hit him once. The force of it had registered on the training hall's impact sensors. The number that appeared on the display board had caused Instructor Mayrath to look at her datapad, then at Griffin, then at the datapad again. Vorith had crossed the mat in a parabolic arc and introduced himself to the far wall. He remembered Aurora's voice from somewhere above him as the ringing faded. "He's fine," she had told the gathering crowd, with the calm assurance of someone who had seen this before. "Griffin hits hard, but he's got good control. Nothing's broken." She had then looked down at Vorith with genuine curiosity. "You okay?" He had not known how to answer that question in any language he spoke. The transformation began the next morning. It was not dramatic at first. A handful of cadets from the Vashani cohort approached Griffin at breakfast and asked, with unusual humility for their species, whether he would be willing to describe what he had done. Griffin had considered the question for a moment, then said he would show them after the midday session. Word traveled. By the time Griffin arrived at the secondary training bay, 43 cadets were waiting. Aurora had already arranged them into a loose semicircle. She had also, somehow, acquired a data board and had written on it in the common script, "Human Close Quarters Doctrine, Open Session." She gave Griffin a look that said, "You were going to do this eventually anyway." He had sighed, which Vorith would come to understand was Griffin's version of agreement. What followed was not a formal class. Griffin did not lecture. He demonstrated, slowly, and let cadets try on him. He absorbed their attempts with a patience that would have read as passive in any other context. But here it was something else, a kind of deliberate openness, as if his body was a question he was inviting them to answer. When a Thalvari cadet managed to execute a redirection correctly on the third attempt, Griffin nodded once, and the cadet stood slightly taller for the rest of the day. Instructor Marath observed from the doorway for 40 minutes and said nothing, but she marked something in her records. Vorith started attending the sessions on the fourth day. He told himself it was tactical intelligence, understanding the method in order to counter it. That was the story he maintained for approximately one session before admitting, privately, that he was there because the human was teaching something genuinely new. Not just technique. Something about the relationship between force and body, between reaction and intention. Kelthari doctrine was built on dominance. What Griffin was demonstrating was closer to conversation, a physical vocabulary that treated every incoming attack as information. It was, Vorith thought, strange. And it worked. Aurora noticed his attendance on the first day, but said nothing until the sixth session, when she fell into step beside him on the way out. You know, she said, on Earth, getting hit that hard by someone, and then coming back to learn from them. That's considered a significant mark of character. Vorith considered this. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, she said. But yes. She smiled with the easy confidence of someone who collected information the way other species collected rank insignia, and Vorith thought he was beginning to understand the particular dynamic between these two humans. Griffin moved through the world and changed it by being in it. Aurora moved through the world and understood it, mapped it, shaped its responses. Together, they were something the Academy had not seen before and did not yet have a framework to classify. The change in the cohort was measurable by the end of the third week. Combat assessment scores across 12 species had improved. More notably, the pattern of improvement had shifted. Cadets who had previously optimized for species-specific strengths were beginning to train across disciplines, borrowing from each other's traditions in ways that the Academy's curriculum had never formally encouraged. A Vishani cadet was drilling Kelthari pressure combinations. Two Thalvari were working with a Grethali on joint defense formations that neither species had practiced together before. The training halls ran longer hours because cadets were staying after formal sessions to keep working. Instructor Marath submitted an observation report to the Academy board. It was 4 pages long. The summary noted, with characteristic understatement, that the recent addition of Terran cadets appears to have introduced novel training dynamics with measurable cross-cohort effects. The board requested a follow-up report in 30 days. On the last day of the month, Vorith found Griffin alone in the training hall, running through a solo form in the low light after most cadets had left. It was something he did every evening, slow, deliberate, the kind of practice that looked simple until you tried to replicate it. Hayes, Vorith said. Griffin stopped and looked at him. That match, Vorith said. You could have ended it differently. More carefully. Griffin was quiet for a moment. You were holding back before you attacked, he said. I wasn't sure if you'd adjust if I went soft. Vorith considered this. It was, in fact, accurate. He had been testing. He had expected the human to flinch, to recalibrate, to show the gap between his calm expression and his actual experience of pressure. Instead, Griffin had answered the test honestly. Fair, Vorith said finally. Griffin nodded and returned to his form. Vorith watched him for a moment, then moved to the other side of the hall and began his own practice. They trained in silence for an hour. A Kelthari warrior and a human from a Deathworld, sharing a room, and the particular understanding of people who have exchanged something real and come out differently on the other side. The Academy would produce its follow-up report in 30 days. It would take considerably longer to fully understand what had walked through its doors when Griffin Hayes arrived, and what it meant that a single punch, landed clean and without malice, had been the beginning of something no curriculum had ever planned for. In the records of the Galactic Academy's Class 7 Sigma cohort, the period would later be marked simply as the Hayes term. The notation was unofficial. It stuck anyway.